Okay. Welcome everyone to today's BC Support Unit webinar. My name is Pat Atherton. I'm responsible for training here at the Support Unit. And I'd like to begin this webinar by acknowledging the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations, from whose traditional lands we're leading this meeting today. I'm going to share my screen so we can see the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be sharing today. So I'd like to take a moment to welcome you all to this webinar, Real World Clinical Trials, or RWCT for short, Methods Cluster. This is an update. Today is June the 8th, 2018, for those who are tuning in to the recording. I've got this open. I'd like to introduce our presenters today. Dr. Hubert Wong, who's lead for the RWCT Methods Cluster, Alison Hoons, who's the KT Specialist for all Methods Clusters, and Nick Bansback, who's the co-lead for Health Economics and Simulation Modeling Methods Cluster. And I believe it is now Hubert?
Alison.
Alison, please.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Alison Hoons, and I hope you can hear us okay. Both Dr. Bansback and I are joining from an illustrious boardroom at a conference, the KT Canada conference today. So we're off-site. We're not at the support unit. So if you have any difficulty hearing, can you just write in the chat box for me? I'm just going to pause for a second to make sure that we're not having anyone having any difficulty hearing. Okay, seeing none, then I'm going to continue. The purpose of this webinar, this is Methods Cluster Month at the support unit. We have 4 webinars that are happening this month. Last week, we had the Data Science and Health Informatics webinar update. Today, of course, is Real World Clinical Trials. Next week will be Knowledge Translation and Implementation Science. And then in the following week after that, we'll have Health Economics and Simulation Modeling. So the purpose of this webinar today is to provide an update about the progress within the Real World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster since the fall of 2017. So we do have a webinar recording from that session in the fall of 2017, which you're welcome to look at on the webpage for Real World Clinical Trials and also on the resources page of the support unit. We're going to be highlighting specifically the projects that are moving forward within the cluster. We hope that you will take this opportunity, whether you're joining us live or you're viewing the recording, to provide us with any input that you have after viewing or listening to the recording. And then we want to provide you just with a little bit of information regarding the next steps for the cluster. So next slide, please. So just as a reminder, what the Real World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster is doing is facilitating a community of methodologists with relevant stakeholders who include our patient partners, our healthcare provider partners, and our healthcare decision maker partners to collectively develop and then to test methods that enhance the feasibility, efficiency, generalizability, and value of clinical trials. So as many people can attest to that were a part of the stakeholder consultations, it's important to be able to define the difference between a clinical trial and a real-world clinical trial. This is up on the web page. So please feel free to delve in this to a little bit more detail yourselves at another time. But essentially, a clinical trial is a trial that's undertaken in an idealized setting, which means that the patient population is intentionally very homogeneous, that there's well-controlled settings, that there's close monitoring, and there's primarily one outcome, and that usually has to do with clinical efficacy. In comparison, a real-world clinical trial looks at how well interventions work in the real world, where things are a little bit messier, where there's less homogeneity of the patient population, where there's usual care settings which have scarce resources, where there's multiple outcomes that are relevant to patients and to other stakeholders. So really what real-world clinical trials is all about is that sort of messier, grayer, real-life practical application of trials. So can we have the next slide, please? When we talk about clinical trial methodology, so many of our stakeholders have said to us that it would be nice to have some definitions by what we mean of method and methodology. So for the purposes of this cluster, we're defining methodology as the procedures that are used to minimize bias, maximize efficiency, and enhance generalizability and value in 3 phases: in the planning of trials, in the execution of trials, and in the analysis and dissemination of trials. Next slide, please. So through the fall of 2017 and into the winter of 2018, we undertook a series of stakeholder consultations. There was a number of one-on-one consultations. There was a widespread call out as well as targeted to research institutes throughout and healthcare organizations throughout BC, where we asked people to respond in an expression of interest and to answer a survey where we asked specifically about the current landscape in BC for clinical trials, for real-world clinical trials, both in terms of strengths and gaps in methods. We then hosted a planning event in September where we brought together stakeholders who included patient partners, methodologists, other types of researchers, clinical decision makers, and practitioners. After the planning event, for those who were unable to attend the planning event, we hosted a webinar. And the intention of that webinar was to share with others the take-home messages from the one-on-one consultations, from the survey, and from the planning event. All of this work then, those 4 previous types of stakeholder consultations, were analyzed collectively to develop some themes and sub-themes for projects which would be undertaken by the methodologists within the cluster. So those themes and sub-themes were then fed back, both widespread through the newsletter of the support unit, as well as directed to all those who had engaged with the methods cluster. Next slide, please. So if we look at this series of consultations, we started from June to October with the one-on-one consultations, the survey, the visioning or planning meeting, the post-meeting survey, and the webinar. Then in the second phase, we asked people to share with us their ideas for the gaps and the current strengths and what opportunities. That then helped to identify themes and project ideas. After identifying the themes and the project ideas, we asked people to self-identify to say, would they like to lead, would they like to collaborate, or would they like to be kept informed of projects? We then worked with them to develop teams and further refine the project ideas, which was phase 3. From phase 3, the work plan was developed and it went through internal review within the support unit, within the Science Council. And the Science Council is comprised of the leads of all the clusters, as well as the scientific director of the methods clusters, Dr. Sterling Bryan. After internal review, these projects have now been, the work plans, which include the projects, have been sent for external review, and we're currently awaiting the results of the external review, and then we can enter phase 4, which is to commence the projects. If you would like to learn more detail about this process, you will see 2 links on this slide. The first link takes you directly to the consultation report, which details all the specifics of it. And then if you would like to see, well, we have 2 locations of that, both on the web page as well as under resources for the support unit. So on to the next slide, please, Pat. So I'm going to pass now over to Dr. Nick Bansbeck, who's going to share some details. The next section of this webinar today is to talk about each of the individual projects that are moving forward within this cluster. And our first presenter for that is Dr. Nick Bansbeck on behalf of this team that you see in front of you. So over to you now, Nick.
Great, thank you very much. I'm speaking today because Dr. Joel Singer was unable to be with us today, but he's leading this project, and my involvement has been partly because he came to me with the problem and wondered whether some of the methods in health economics could help the problem that he's identified, and so I'm acting as a sort of a link between the methods clusters here. There's other members involved, and some knowledge users, including Laura McGee, who was and is still affiliated at BC Children's, now in the UK, and some patient partners, some of which are in place and some are really going to be recruiting. So if we can go to the next slide, I will tell you a little about the project. I'm just going to be very brief here, but the bottom line here is that we're talking about composite endpoints. These are increasingly being used. Often it's here to sort of reduce sample size calculations, but also to reflect one of the issues with real-world clinical trials, that multiple outcomes are important to patients. And so composites are being used to sort of combine multiple outcomes into one. But the issue with them, and when you look at how they're being used, is they're often effectively arbitrary weighting these outcomes. So if you've got 2 outcomes in a composite, they tend to just be assigned equal weight, so 50-50. But actually, does this reflect the importance to patients overall, individually? And so the question that we're really exploring here is how can we rethink about how we weight outcomes in composites. So if you go to the next slide, we're going to use a case study, partly out of convenience, partly this is what triggered the question work that Joel has been doing with Laura McGee in interventions in pregnancy, where you've got a natural composite where you often have both the woman and the infant have clear outcomes. And so many trials in this space are composites, combining both those outcomes. But even within both those outcomes, there's sub-outcomes which are of importance. So one study we're going to try and use is the CHIPS trial, which was looking at interventions to control hypertension in pregnant women. This is just an example. And again here, this is just thinking about these composites. Are they equally weighted, or actually are there different weights in terms of the way people value the outcomes involving the women and the outcomes involving the infant? And qualitative work that we've been doing in the past has sort of shown that there's heterogeneity on what these weights would be, and clear indication that it may well not be 50-50 overall, but actually it might vary from woman to woman. And the implication is actually that the trial result might be quite different depending on the weights that you use. So if we go to the next slide, we're going to, in this study, develop values from patients to try and understand both what these weights might be and the heterogeneity in these weights. And so this is using some health economics methods. We're going to be doing some surveys of pregnant women to understand the relative importance of these outcomes. We're then going to use the results of that to reanalyze the CHIPS data to see, well, you know, would the CHIPS trial have different results if we incorporated these weights further than the traditional composite endpoints? And so while we're using this as a case study, we're using the CHIPS trial as a case study. We have a broader outlook in mind of using the results of this work to rethink how others could be using and designing composite endpoints in future trials. So even though we are focusing on this CHIPS study for now, we are keeping in mind the application beyond this patient group. If we go to the next slide, I've sort of talked a little about the methods that we're using, so the qualitative interviews, the survey work, then there's going to be some analysis of that survey, and then effectively we're going to be reanalyzing the trial data to see the potential impact. I think what's interesting here, and the methods, sort of second methods aspect to this work, is how do we apply sort of average weights or individual weights? We suspect that we're going to find that there's subgroups of women with different sort of preferences for these, and so there might be different results of the trial depending on which preference cluster you sit in. So there's then going to be a natural application of, well, how do we use the results based in the future based on the individual weights of a particular woman. So if we go to the next slide, I'm done. So we're hoping that to get some great feedback on external review, and then we'll be happy to disseminate our work as we go forward. And I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Nick. And Hubert, over to you, please.
Right. Okay. So for project number 2, the lead is SN Kareem. He's overseas right now, so he's not able to present, but he was kind enough to actually record a presentation, which is available or accessible through one of the links that you see at the bottom of the slide. I will spend a minute or two just discussing this project, because I think some people might be looking at this title and saying, well, what does this title even mean? And so the basic idea is that in sort of traditional clinical trials, we evaluate whether one treatment is better than the other treatment by looking at the outcomes from everyone from one arm and comparing it to the outcomes from everyone in the other arm. Now, one of the issues with doing that is that, well, during the course of a trial, lots of different things happen to patients who, and as a result, they may discontinue the study. It might be because they don't feel the treatment is working for them, so they simply drop out. Or on the opposite side, it might be that they actually feel good and they feel that they don't need the treatment anymore. But the result of that is that when you compare all patients in one arm to all patients in another arm, it may not actually reflect what's happening to individual patients. Okay? And so what you want to do is that you would like to have some way of teasing out whether or not the differences that you're seeing in the arms are actually due to the treatment or actually due to things like different people dropping out of different arms. And so there are some new advanced statistical methods that will help you to do that, and that is basically what the goal of this project is to develop these statistical tools to help us answer that question. Right, so moving on to project 3, so this is the one where I'm leading, and it's sort of generically labeled as increasing statistical efficiency in real-world clinical trials. Okay. There's quite a large number of people involved in this, as you can see on the slide, and maybe what I'll do is I'll just move on to the next slide where it has a little bit better detail. Here, there's actually going to be 2 sub-projects within this project, and quite distinct and unrelated to each other. Now, by increasing efficiency, there's various ways that one can measure or judge efficiency, including things like cost and the amount of time it takes to do a trial. But what we're really focusing on in this project is trying to figure out how do we reduce the number of participants that we need to enroll. And so in the first sub-project, what we're trying to address is the question of how do you set up your trial, how do you design your trial so that the results you get out are the most precise possible. Okay? And in the second sub-project, what we're hoping to do is to be able to say, before going into the trial, well, we actually know quite a bit about how well these treatments work already. Can we leverage the information from outside the trial so that when we combine it with trial information, we can come to an answer more quickly than just relying on trial information alone? Subproject 1 was motivated by a trial that is about to get underway. It's called the Tech for Home trial in home health monitoring. And so these are patients who are being discharged from the hospital with heart failure. And these patients typically end up coming back to hospital very quickly. I think it's something on the order of like 20% of them will come back within 3 months. And so what we're hoping to do, or what this trial is hoping to show, is that if we send these people home with these new high-tech monitoring devices to monitor their condition, we might be able to gather information which will better help us to determine whether or not these patients actually need to go back to hospital or whether they're safe to stay at home. Okay? And so this is a real-world trial. It's going to be done in about 20 hospitals across BC. And we're going to randomize hospitals using what's called a cross-sectional step wedge design. And so here what happens is that the hospitals aren't just being randomized to giving patients this monitoring equipment or not giving it to them, but instead all hospitals start off under standard of care without any monitoring. And what we're doing is that we're randomizing the time at which hospitals will transition to giving patients these monitoring devices. Okay? So let's say if you have 20 hospitals, and let's say we're going to have 5 time points at which we transition hospitals, then at each transition time there will be 4 hospitals switching over. Okay? Now, what happens is that we know that the number of patients is very different across hospitals in BC. There's a few very large hospitals, some medium-sized hospitals, and a lot of small hospitals where we probably won't be enrolling that many patients. And it turns out that if you just sort of do your randomization without any restriction, so any hospital can end up in any transition step, then you could actually end up with an allocation which is very inefficient. That is to say that at the end of the day, you'll find out that your trial doesn't actually have the power to show benefit just because of how these hospitals were allocated. Okay. And so what we're trying to do in this project is to figure out, well, why is this the case? to figure out, well, how should we randomize hospitals to ensure that we have adequate power, and more broadly, to then develop software to help other trial designers with their trials to figure out what's the best way for them to randomize when we have these somewhat complex trial designs, and there's a concern that the trial might end up being underpowered. The second sub-project is motivated by another trial, which is about to get underway. And so this is a study in a condition called cerebral venous thrombosis, which is a fairly rare condition. Across Canada, there's only maybe like 400 or 500 cases per year. And what it is that the standard of care is that patients go on to standard antithrombotic drugs like warfarin, heparin, and such, which are known to be effective, but they also induce quite a burden on the patients in that these patients have to go in for lab tests weekly to ensure that their INR, which is a measure of their blood thickness or thinness, remains in the safe range. Okay? There's these newer drugs called direct oral anticoagulants, or DOACs, which are now commonly used for other conditions similar to CVT, but they're not licensed for CVT. Okay? There's a little bit of experience with clinicians using these drugs off-label for CVT. And there's some belief that there's no particular reason why this drug shouldn't work just as well as it works in other conditions. Okay? And so there is a potential that we could leverage all this information on DOAC efficacy used in other conditions or used that haven't been used off-label to combine that information with the information that we're going to get from our trial in order to come up with an answer more quickly. Okay. Now, the big hurdle in doing this is to try to figure out, well, how do you summarize this external information? And the standard way this is done is by what we call prior elicitation of expert opinion. So we need to get together these clinicians who are familiar with how well these DOACs work, and try and get them to review the literature and come up with a summary of how well DOACs work compared to the standard of care drugs. But the sort of current methods for doing this are, well, one would say rather non-intuitive. And so what we're trying to do is come up with a better way of eliciting these prior distributions. The fourth project that's on our list for this cluster is being led by Penny Brasher. This one is a little bit, it's just on hold at the moment for some personnel reasons. Okay, but what the objective of this trial is to do is to try to come up with ways to improve and retain patients in clinical trials. And so are there ways that we can use technology to make it easier for people to participate and to agree to participate? Okay. We'll have more details on this project in a subsequent webinar. Okay. You can move to the next slide. All right. Now, there is one other project which is not on this list. It's still sort of being in formulation phase, and so that's why we don't want to say anything about it just yet. But I do want to sort of let people know that the reason why we've selected the projects that we've just talked about is because in the consultation process, these were identified to be priorities, and there were people who self-identified as being interested in leading these projects. Okay. There's a bunch of other projects that were identified which are sort of sitting on the shelf and percolating, and we're hoping to get more people involved and more people who will be willing to lead these projects. And so I'd really like to people in the audience to think about whether you'd like to get involved in leading these projects or being involved in these projects, and to contact Allison or myself so that we can start discussions about how to develop these proposals for a round two, which we don't have a set date yet for them, but I'm thinking somewhere later this fall, maybe late October or early November. We'd like to be able to have a second set of projects to send out for review and to get them going. Okay. Other comments? Yeah, so I think I hope that people have sort of gotten the flavor of what the sorts of projects this cluster is interested in, but I don't want people to think that projects have to be specifically like the ones that have just been presented. And if you have other ideas, we'd be happy to talk with you about them.
Thanks very much, Hubert and Nick and Allison. I'm going to unmute everyone. You probably discovered that you have been muted. And if you would prefer, you could pose a question via chat. And I see we have a first question here. So I'm just going to read it aloud to everybody so that you can know what it is. Project number 4, Hubert. Several weeks ago, a workshop with clinical trial participants conducted with Clinical Trials BC brought the patient voice into translating the knowledge from the National Clinical Trial Participation Survey. This is part of the KT strategy of the BC-led initiative, and this group, Penelope Brasher, should be connected with Allison Orth so that the work can be synergized with this methods cluster instead of run in parallel and separate. Thoughts?
I think that's a good idea. I'm not sure if Penny is even aware of this, but we can certainly send this information to her and get her in contact with those people.
Great, thanks. I just unmuted actually, Pat. Thanks for mentioning that, and thanks for reading that question. It's me, Hubert, Cindy Triton. So the AHSN supporting Clinical Trials BC, this is one of their key projects for year 1 in their plan, and it's been an initiative that was born and raised in British Columbia, which eventually went national and now has the results available. Unfortunately, the patient voice didn't enter during the planning phase of the survey, but the patient voice is definitely here in helping sense make and then try to develop best practices for recruitment and retention into clinical trials. So there's an exact overlap of the goals, and it would just make absolute sense and also represent an intersection between Clinical Trials BC and the BC Support Unit work, which is also important.
Great, thanks so much, Cindy. I see, Joseph, you have your hand up. Your question, please. Joseph, we're not able to hear you. I'm wondering if you might want to use the chat function, or maybe you're muted at your end on your machine. Okay. Joseph tells us that he did not mean to raise his hand. Any other questions from listeners today?
I have a question regarding project number 3, also for Hubert. With the 20 hospitals that you have, how are you collecting the data from all the hospitals, and are you going through harmonized ethics review? Or I'm just interested in how this is being implemented, how this study is going to be implemented.
Right. So now I'm not familiar with sort of the operational details of the trial, so I can't specifically answer the question about the ethics. Now, there is data collection both from the patients, but we'll also be accessing or linking with the administrative data, to track things like readmissions and so on.
Oh, okay.
If you're specifically interested, I can provide you with the person who is sort of in charge of the operations of the trial.
You know, that would be very useful. One of the conversations that we have here locally as we seek to understand more about the real-world clinical trials and how our research capacity building department can support organizational capacity and capacity on the island to participate, we struggle to understand some of the operational logistics that have to happen, and that ties into us and how we organize ourselves to best enable this work to happen, at least on the island. So it would be actually good. This is a nice, crispy example of a real-world approach and some of the logistics that are underway. And I think also that ethics boards, which actually now, as the HSN is now supporting the Harmonized Ethics Review, I think there's a lot of learning that will have to go to the ethics boards as well as to those groups in the organizations responsible for operational review. And that might be, and learning at this level can help departments like mine facilitate that learning within the organization.
Right. Can you just email me and then I'll get you a text?
Yeah, very good.
Thanks, Cindy.
That's Wendy.
Oh, was that Wendy? No, that was Cindy.
No, that was Cindy.
Yeah.
Oh, that's Cindy.
Cindy on the island, Wendy in the interior. Any other questions from our listeners today?
If no one else has one, I have another one. Cindy again.
Go ahead, Cindy, on the island.
Project number 2, again, this is Hubert. So are the reasons that people are withdrawing important for you to understand as you develop, I guess, the operational strategy for this study?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And in fact, I mean, that one of the aspects of that project is trying to deal with is how does the reason for withdrawing affect how you should interpret the results?
That's really interesting. Excellent. So, so again, Hubert, the clinical trial participation survey that was done in BC, most of the data is actually BC data, but there's also national data there because it went national. But it was unique in terms of actually asking the questions about premature discontinuation. And that's one of the things that sets it apart from other surveys that have been done in other jurisdictions outside of Canada, that where there might be some learning and, again, some synergy in taking a look at that and connecting with Alison Orth. She's working, I think, with CHAOSS, somebody, a statistician at CHAOSS, to get that data analyzed. But it might be just informative for you to take a look at that, because it was actually a focus, and it was a unique focus, and there's not much data available on that yet.
Do you know who it was at CHAOSS that she's working with?
No, I can't remember, but I'll find out. I mean, I just can't think of it off the top of my head, because Alison works closest with her, so, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'd be interested to know who it was, and so I could talk to that person. Probably just down the hall from me or something.
Yeah, absolutely, that's right. And then I have one question also. Does anyone else have any questions? Because I have another one, but I don't want to take up all the airspace.
Why don't you go ahead, Cindy? We've got time.
Okay, so the first project is, the embedding patient values in RCTs. That is all of these projects, actually. It's really exciting to see this work underway. And for me, getting an idea of what this methods cluster is doing, it's now very helpful in seeing the nature of the projects. For embedding patient values in RCTs, that's another really important area of learning that will represent, I think, eventually a shift in the way that we look at the design. And when we say we, it's the collective we, not only those that are designing and implementing, but also, again, those reviewing, like the ethics boards. I'm just wondering how you go about, or what you're planning to do to develop the values. Are you looking to assess values from patients that can be used to create this patient-oriented composite outcomes? Or what do you mean when you say develop the values from patients?
So this is Alison. Unfortunately, Nick has had to leave to go and give a presentation. So not available to, because we're at a conference today.
Right.
So, yeah, so he's not able, he couldn't stay to address the questions. But he did ask me that if there were specific questions, his email address is provided on the last slide. Actually, his email address isn't on that slide, but it's nick.banspec@ubc.ca. And he asked me to share with people to please email him if they had any specific questions.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Allison. Thanks, Cindy. Any other questions? I hear none, and I believe that means that our work today together is done. Thank you very much, Hubert, for presenting. Very informative and helpful for all of us. Thank you very much, Allison, for taking time out of your conference to chime in and help us understand from your perspective. And thank you, Nick, in absentia. Thank you all for tuning in today. And this recording will be up on our website within the next work day or two, so you'll be able to share it with your colleagues. And we will also be promoting it via our newsletter and social media for those who have not had a chance to listen in. Just a final pitch, Hubert was looking for interested parties. If you are interested in any of this content, please contact Hubert. His email address is there, or contact Allison, whose email address is likewise on the slide in front of us just now. Any final comments, Hubert or Allison?
Nothing except that I really want to thank people for attending, and I hope that I hear from you.
Thank you. Allison, any final thoughts?
I just want to say how excited I am to see these come to fruition. The process over the last year in speaking with people throughout the province, all wearing different hats and all really passionate about trying to ensure that our research, our healthcare research, is with, from, and by patients. And these kinds of projects, I think, nicely illustrate how when there's structure and there's resources and there's passion, we can get to a stage where we're answering questions and designing things differently than has been done before. So thank you all for all of those who have contributed so importantly to the development of this cluster.
Lovely thoughts. Thank you, Allison. And with that, I will draw this to a close. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you all pleasant weekends if you're listening to this in real time. Bye now.
Okay, thank you. Bye, thanks.